Good morning, everyone. Oh, hi. Yes, my name is Olya. I'm a research fellow, and today I want to share with you what I know about poverty and inequality in Ukraine. This works. I want you to remember three things from this presentation. You might forget many things I say, but three things is poverty rates are actually really high in Ukraine, probably higher than you expect. Second is because of these lived experiences of poverty and inequality, a large share, majority of Ukrainian population have very deep feeling of mistreatment and grievances toward the government. And a third is that these feelings can be easily leveraged and tapped to by Russian misinformation, which poses a great risk to state consolidation. My presentation is drawing on my PhD research. I completed it around 2020, 2021. It might seem like it's a bit dated because we're in 2025, but the themes and the trends are the same. And in fact, I hope that because the data was collected in 2019, you will realize and appreciate how far these feelings run and how deep they are. You might wonder, why did I decide to write about poverty and inequality in Ukraine? And frankly, it was out of maybe disappointment and frustration in the existing literature. And I came to Oxford to study comparative social policy, and I saw a lot of research on poverty, high quality research on the OECD countries, on the global north, and then also on the global south, like Latin America and countries in the African continent. And then I really struggled to find anything that was on par about post-Soviet countries in Ukraine. There's heaps of literature about the politics, the West versus Russia, misguided hopes for the transformation and so on, but there wasn't much social policy perspective on the lived experience in Ukraine. Moreover, it was quite surprising that the World Bank and many of the experts from UK government offices, they had a wrong perception about Ukraine. They assumed it was a high-income country because it's a white majority country in Europe. Frankly, a few weeks ago, I had an FCDO colleague say, "Why are you including Ukraine in your analysis? It's a high-income country." But just a few years ago, it was a lower middle-income country. It wasn't a high-income country. And when I was about to embark on my PhD, 74% of people in Ukraine self-identified as poor. They saw themselves as poor and identified as such in the household surveys. So I was curious about this gap between how we are perceived by our Western analysts and by colleagues at the World Bank and so forth, and how Ukrainians perceive themselves. As Dr. Natalia said, the 1990s were quite turbulent time. There was a complete government budget collapse, hyperinflation, patronage, took off really quickly, which hampered job development. On top of it, there were fiscal adjustments that maybe have been misguided. But if we're thinking about how this felt for people living in Ukraine, it was, everyone was materially deprived, essentially. People didn't have basic goods. There was a survival mode for the majority of the population who turned to agriculture. We didn't have electricity, and the life expectancy drop in Ukraine was one of the most rapid ones recorded ever in history. This dip was more intense than 1930s Great Depression you've seen in the US. So Ukraine is actually much poorer than the neighbors. You see that the green color shows its GDP per capita. Similarly, I think oftentimes people not familiar with the region assume that Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, the living standards are about similar, and that's not true. There's a really big gap between the quality of life in Poland versus Ukraine, and let alone between Germany and Ukraine. At present, around 25 to 30% of Ukrainians are food insecure, which is one of the common ways to measure objective poverty. UNHCR says that in 2025, 36% of Ukrainians qualify for humanitarian aid, which is, of course, a large percent of people are displaced, internally displaced from Eastern Europe, but increasingly more and more people also qualify for humanitarian aid based on food insecurity. Right. So with this puzzle, I decided to go and interview people in Ukraine, in my hometown, Rivne. Not only was it easy to recruit people because I have social networks there, it was also the more average city in terms of subjective poverty rates. Because if we go to Kyiv, it's only about half people would identify as poor. If we were to go to the east of Ukraine, the rates were around 90%. So the city in Western Ukraine was more average representative. And I targeted people who are high income and low income because I was really mostly puzzled about those who are identified as high income based on their just spending, but they still see themselves as poor. That was 32% of the top decile still identified as poor. I wanted to talk to them and understand why they see themselves as such. Out of 50 people I interviewed, 38 identified themselves as poor. I'm not going, this is a narrative analysis. If you pull up my thesis, you can go more in depth, but essentially I was trying to trace all the different narratives of how people see themselves and explain the inequality in Ukraine. So what is this phenomena of subjectively poor majority in Ukraine? What did the 74% of Ukrainians mean by saying we are poor? So poverty is not a static group. People move in and out of poverty throughout their life course. We're most likely to be poor when we're kids and then also in the elderly age. Moreover, people can dip into poverty when they get ill, for example. So people who identified as poor in my sample, they have experienced poverty in the 90s. Remember that big dip when everything crashed? So many people were referencing to that. And then we're also thinking about their future, looking at their grandparents and saying, most likely I will be poor again when I age because I have no savings and there's no viable pension mechanism in place. There was a very strong element of collective identity, and this probably has a lot to do with communist past, but there was a binary understanding, you know, this is us, and then there's a tiny little elite. And people used the word poor people and average, тобто бідні люди, прості люди, interchangeably. There was very high support for structural explanations of poverty, which on a global scale is actually very unique. If you go to many African countries where I work or the US, explanations of poverty are oftentimes individualistic. It's person's failure, they're lazy, you know, they're individualistic. Where in Ukraine, the default explanation was structural, which is quite unique. People were very quick to point out systematic and government failures when explaining why elderly people are poor, why young people are struggling to secure their livelihoods. The constant relative comparison to normal Europe was there. And something that's like very qualitatively hard to capture, but there's a strong narrative of deservingness and at the same time, a lot of repulsion almost to Ukrainians and self-hate. This is just one quote of how the lived experience is linked to perceptions of the government. This woman, she was living in a tiny apartment with her husband, her daughter's husband, children, and they were squished in this space, couldn't afford to upgrade any of the furniture. She really struggled to make the ends meet. And she said, the most corrupt countries are Ukraine. If I could, I would go in the open fields and shoot all of them. I would kill all of them politicians because I'm just so sick of all of this. I'm so sick of being constantly frugal, of the fact that you cannot afford what you want, simply sick of it. I don't know how people could continue to tolerate it and at what point they will continue to tolerate it. You might think, well, is this lady talking about poverty or is she talking about something else? Have we departed from poverty? And that's probably because you're most familiar with the conceptualization of poverty as lack of resources to meet needs only, right? So most common statistics you see are focusing on the lack of income, resources, expenses, like absolute poverty measures by the World Bank, as well as the relative measures of 60% of median income. The caveat of these measures is that they're not objective. If we, for example, in the OECD countries, when we look at poverty and use different measures to capture who is poor, the overlap is quite small. It's only about 1/3. That's why over time in OECD countries, we've started to also leverage subjective poverty measures and actually asking people, do you feel poor? Because people transition in and out of poverty. If we interpret those quotes, you could also think that, well, she could still be talking about poverty because poverty is actually not just lack of resources. It's lack of capabilities to live a life one finds worth valuing, one feels proud of. It's this idea of freedom to pursue a better life. Then there's other scholars who actually think of poverty as oppressive social relations. So they say that, well, if we only look at income and basic needs, we're missing the point because we're not addressing the root causes of poverty, which are really based in unequal social relations. Which is why now, anytime we're intervening in the global south, we're also conducting political economy analysis. We're conducting political settlements analysis to understand the power structures that hold the inequality in the way that it is now, and try to find ways to change the power structure to improve the quality of life for those who don't have that much power. Again, I'm not citing here resources, but if you go into my theoretical chapter, you'll find all the references to all the scholars who discuss this. All right, so we understand that there's different ways to conceptualize poverty. Interviewed people, and most of them squish everything together from income to inability to have a fulfilling life, and also bring in the state. And all of this impacts how people see themselves, right? It's their identity. It's how they say, I am poor. We are poor as Ukrainians. So I was trying to find a conceptual framework after coming from field work of bringing this together. And I leaned on the recognition theory by Axel Honneth, who's a German scholar. And they bring together research on psychology and how we develop our sense of self and social justice. And they talk that over time, we're social beings. We don't exist in isolation. We understand ourselves through repeated interactions with social systems, with other people, and with the state. And over time, that teaches us or builds a perception of who we are and what value we hold and how other people perceive us as valuable or not. And so if people feel that their value is not accurately reflected in the way they're treated at work, in the way they're treated in society, in the way they're treated by the state, people feel misrecognition. Is this idea of that your value is not recognized. Familiar relations were not actually explored. People didn't talk much about familiar relations, but people talked extensively in Ukraine about the lack of social esteem, particularly men, and then also the lack of social rights. I invite you to read more about just how the lack of jobs and prospects emasculates Ukrainian men, and how, relative poverty also plays a huge role in that. But today, because we're talking about the states, I'll focus on social rights, particularly education, healthcare, pensions, and legal institutions. This might not be a surprise to people who've lived in Ukraine. You know this because you've experienced this. But one thing that was common for high and low income people is that they felt poor when they came in contact with the healthcare system because they felt that their life was not valued. Doctors oftentimes can purchase their medical degrees, so you don't know when you're going to see a doctor whether they're qualified or not, and many people had to use their social networks to ensure that they come in contact with a qualified doctor. Moreover, you had to pay for your health expenses out of pocket. So even if you're making high income now, if you get very ill and you have to put all of your savings into medical care, well, guess what? You won't be high income anymore. And people were very aware of this risk all the time, that something could happen, a social shock could happen, like health illness, and they would lose any security that they've achieved over the last few years. Of course, low-income people were also more likely to experience mistreatment. So the actual quality of interaction in the hospital, which is very different, or a clinic, from what they achieve at the end, also over time made them feel like, I'm not valued. They don't see me as a human being. And from there, they made assumptions of what the state thinks about them. Higher education was a similar story. The fact that some people could buy their degrees while others had to work hard to achieve their diploma left very, very bitter residue in many people's self-perception and understanding of Ukraine. The justice system, it's interesting. Dr. Natalia mentioned social contract, because my respondents also mentioned social contract a lot, but they said that there are two social contracts. There's one for the elite, and then there's one for the poor, for the rest of us. They felt like there was no protection. Even those who were high income, those were the most fascinating interviews. They're explaining to me that, I'm poor, not because I have money, but I'm poor because at any moment someone could come in and squeeze away my life's work. Someone could take away my business, and there's no legal protection that would help me or stand by my side. We talk so much in academia how the revolution of dignity was about democracy, and we forget that surveys show people who actually, and this is by Olya Homonchuk, who's a professor at Manchester, she was there collecting survey data, and one of the key grievances was a better economic future. People were there because they wanted to have a dignified life like the normal Europe. They wanted to have a better economic life, and they were comparing their lives to Europeans. I could go more into the double edge of subjective poverty, but I don't think I have time. It was also heartbreaking how much people flip-flopped between saying we're deserving, we should have a better life, but then they also were saying, well, we're so stupid. If we deserve better, we would do better. It was quite, I'm a bit removed from Ukraine because I live abroad. It was quite heartbreaking. So when we're criticizing Ukraine as Ukrainians, I just want you to be mindful of that. So this goes beyond my PhD research, but currently I work mostly on political economy and development in African countries and so forth. And I lived in the US for a very long time. And when I see Russian misinformation work is when they tap into existing feelings of injustice that are objectively, there for the right reasons. So in African countries, it's colonial history, right? There will be a lot of, on social media, they will put next to each other, they will package about colonial history and then add misinformation to it. And that hooks people very easily because people use shortcuts to make sense of information. And so if something is not factually accurate, but it aligns with their existing beliefs, it's very quick. We're very quick to just keep going with that information. In the Midwest, in the US, there are a lot of valid concerns about how unaffordable higher education is. The fact that it's reserved for the elite. And you can see now how over time that eroded, and now we're essentially losing a lot of research funding. But people who were upset about the inequality of access to higher education, then a lot of misinformation took those narratives and went along with it. In Ukraine, you only have to scratch the surface to get to these feelings. These feelings are deep and very close to the surface. And so now it's sometimes hard to know where the boundary is with objective critique of the government versus misinformation packaged on top of those valid critiques. There is misinformation about mass recruitment of women and youth to terrify people, but we know that there are actual issues with the recruitment into the army in Ukraine. There was exaggeration blowing up about misuse of foreign aid. Again, we know there's corruption, but it's hard to judge the extent of it. Terrifying people in eastern Ukraine that Western parts are going to just abandon them and so forth. I can keep giving you examples, but let's leave it for further sessions today. To wrap up, I hope you walk away from this remembering that the levels of material deprivation in Ukraine are high, that 36% of Ukrainians are qualified for humanitarian aid at the moment. Large share of population feels mistreated by the government because of their lived experiences of hardship, and they have this collective identity that unites them around it. And last, and this is a point for discussion, is that Russia can leverage these feelings to push forward their message. Thank you.